I fail at meetings. Hi, everybody. I'm like really, really great at setting up meetings, apparently. So I'll just sit here and do the needful. And Ben is change the host. Maybe I'll make you a co-host, Ben, so I can keep letting people in.
Thanks.
Cool. Yeah, consider me a fly on the wall. This is all you.
Okay, well, hi everyone. Apologies for this being so ad hoc. We'll hope to get this regularly scheduled on everyone's calendars, have an agenda doc, etc. In the meantime, it's good to see you all. Does anyone have anything they want to start off with?
We need an agenda doc, I think.
Yeah, definitely. I can throw up something temporary. I believe there's an actual process for doing this correctly, and we're just not quite there yet.
I have a template doc you can copy paste from in a little bit, but I would just fire up a Google Doc for today.
Yeah, I will get started with taking some notes as well.
We can go through the backlog of the kind repo if you want as well.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to invite you all to a doc. So here is a temp doc. Which hopefully you all can see if you're in sig-testing.
Okay, yeah, doc looks good.
Thanks. Okay. So I know we had a number of things that people were looking into. We were looking at some discussion recently that I need to get back to about the load balancers and configuring that better. And I know Lubomir was working on some kube test integration so we can actually use this thing in pre-submit. I'll add, over the weekend, I pushed through a patch so that we can test with multi-node actually in CI so that we're not failing the conformance tests. I believe we might need to actually follow up upstream on that because we're also telling the test how many nodes there are. I think this may break Sonabui.
A question there. So why do we have to pass the number of nodes to the end-to-end testing framework? That part I don't understand.
So when you tell it provider, it will use provider magic to find some things. I'm not sure if it finds that one, but otherwise it doesn't seem to auto-detect like anything. And that flag defaults to, I think, -1, and the test is looking for there must be at least 2 nodes. So we're both running multi-node and actually setting that flag currently.
I mean, it makes sense to pass a flag like in the sense that, hey, I expect my cluster to be running 5 nodes, for instance. And then when the tests are running, they should detect that there are actually 5 nodes.
Right.
Yeah.
The other thing we should follow up on upstream is I believe that's looking for the number of worker nodes, which wasn't actually clear. So kind of will be useful for this, but I think it'll be easier for everyone if we make these things more obvious. We do have a number of things in the backlog as well as like 10 PRs open. I know George has been doing some awesome stuff to actually get us a known issues guide. I'm hoping to work with him and some of you all somewhere to get a doc site up this week. We have Netlify integration enabled, but we need to create an actual site on the Netlify end. So I'm hoping to get that up this week. I don't want to just have all me talking here. Does anyone have anything they wanted to talk about with everyone here?
So I was looking to work on the ARM64 support, and besides what's obvious in there, I'm wondering if there be dragons elsewhere that I just won't know by glancing at the issues and what I've had to deal with in dashboard.
So I think the biggest dragon is that we have to do a lot of actual installation. Normally, if you're going to make an ARM image, you try to stick to like, I cross compile a binary for ARM and I copy it onto an existing image. But we need to install all of the things that a Kubernetes needs besides Kubernetes itself, and that's our own image. So we will also need to build that from ARM because it's actually running a lot of code. So I think the way to go there is to request resources from, I think that was OpenLab, and set up some kind of integration in Prow where we have a periodic or a post-submit job that goes and builds those images for ARM. And then we'll have to look at, I think probably initially the easiest thing to do is to just tag those as special ARM images until we know that that works. But then later we can try to somehow make sure that our official released images have manifest lists for both ARM and AMD 64. Unfortunately, I don't think it's super feasible to just do cross-compile. We can probably get the Kubernetes install to look like that, but we'll need the base image with everything else. I think we're pretty unlikely to be able to do that with just file copy operations.
All right.
That's kind of a big dragon.
Is it possible? Is it possible to request in Pro? Is it possible to request basically a container that is running ARM64 under Pro?
It is not right now. I mean, so Prow runs against Kubernetes clusters. So in theory, if we could get a sustained ARM64 cluster somewhere, we should be able to plumb through stuff and point some jobs at that cluster. You have something?
I have. So I applied for the CNCF packet.net lab thing. So I have CNCF credits on packet.net for doing Kubernetes development. I could spin one up, but it would be one that I would have to manage.
Right, that's the biggest issue is that we'd be asking someone to keep this thing running, which is where I'm leaning towards. Maybe we just have a machine that we SSH to from a Prow job and run the build. That might be a lot more manageable because then we're not really depending on that box much, and we're not trying to ourselves become a Kubernetes provider or something. For the main cluster, we use GKE and let some magical Google SREs somewhere manage that for us, hopefully.
I mean, I guess the alternative is to use emulation, but I think there are objections against this.
I mean, I think if you can get it to work, but then we're probably going to be back to VMs, and I mean that's sort of why we built Kind, is to avoid having to run VMs in CI. Kind of an awkward chicken and egg there.
Yeah, I think when we've looked at building ARM things like that before, the only issue I've found is that you have to plumb QEMU into every single Docker build context that you're building in, which, I mean, isn't the end of the world, but yeah, and it is astoundingly slow without KVM.
It is also possible that we could resort to, I mean, so today the images that we publish are not actually in CI. We are hoping to get it that way, but we could resort to ARM images being built from someone's machine that has QEMU set up and so forth.
I mean, this relates to the Kate's infra group work, and without the CNCF supporting this ARM cluster, we cannot really proceed with Kind as well supporting ARM in a way.
I'd hope we could at least like check it out. Like Dims did this briefly, where he just got an ARM box on Packet, I think, and patched kind slightly and built on there and ran it. We can maybe have like semi-official support initially while we long-term sort that out.
Yeah, if you have a machine, a VM somewhere, we can use it for testing, like a primitive testing setup at least.
Right, but getting it maintainable long-term is definitely going to be interesting. For the Linux AMD 64 stuff, we should be able to set up some builds on the trusted cluster and just auto push images on Kubernetes releases and get that mostly maintaining itself. But I'm not sure how well we can do that on ARM, just because like maintaining the ARM cluster itself is going to be a lot of work.
Yes, and it's going to cost money as well.
Right. I mean, it looks like we can probably request the actual machines, but someone's time to actually keep everything working smoothly is a whole nother thing. Like I said, we already don't have enough time allocated to that for the existing build clusters. We avoid doing that as much as possible. I guess another interesting topic that we had recently was whether we wanted to actually go forth with CLI flags for multi-node. I see arguments both for and against, and I'm not sure which is best. I'd love to hear thoughts on that one. I'll post the PR for context. I think most of you have seen this already. I mean, so on the positive side, having flags is easier for users to use generally. People don't like having to go edit files. On the other hand, they can be a lot harder to maintain. They're not versioned. If we start adding a flag for every named node type, then if we add more later, we wind up with a lot of flags. On the other hand, if we have some kind of structured field, then you have some of the same kinds of like versioning issues. I'm actually sort of towards it might make sense to just stick to configuration, given how small and simple our config is. I don't know if it's a massive ask to ask someone to like put a snippet to write out the config first, but I know myself when I'm using a tool, if I can just toss a flag on, that's the first thing I'm going to do to try it, and then I'm going to come back and actually use config later.
I think I'm the only person that is against these specific flags. So if you guys have consensus, just go ahead and add the PR. I think somebody in Slack suggested a slightly different syntax for the replicas. I'm not sure you saw it.
Yeah, that looked like that was the one with the structured format in a single flag.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that starts to look a little bit like putting an unversioned config into a flag. I'm not sure if that's a good idea. I would lean towards that's not a good idea.
Yes. Another question here, like I'm going to leave this to Fabrizio later to comment about it. Like we have a load balancer that we have to make implicit because of these flags. If we add multiple control plane nodes.
So to be fair, I'd already been discussing possibly making that load balancer implicit. I don't think it's super great UX that if you want a multiple control plane cluster, you also need to remember to add a load balancer that you can't configure in any way anyhow. If we do later add configuration for the load balancer, we can have a field for configuring the load balancer. Go ahead.
If I can say something, I think that first of all, those are two separate concerns. Mm-hmm. So the UX and the flags is something that we can design in order to make it usable. And this is why in implementing the PR, I choose to add only two flags and to make the load balancer implicit, because I see flags as something that is for the beginners, so the user that don't want to think about it. But the fact that in the CLI there is two flags, and this flag makes the load balancer implicit, does not make or does not imply that you have to do the same in the config. You can leave the config free for the expert user to make their own cluster. For instance, in the config, I might be that I want to add a load balancer in front of a single node, of a single master, because then I want to grow the number of my masters. So, in my opinion, those are two separate concerns. And I implemented the PR, and immediately after I started using the flag. They are simple to use.
Mm-hmm.
Even if I have all the snippet ready to use. So I'm in favor, but there is no opinion as a UX. So
I guess, how has it panned out with Kubetum, the problem being where you can't mix the flags in the config? Has that?
It's a pretty horrible problem, and we don't have any solutions. Like, Viper, we've discussed it multiple times. We definitely need something that follows this particular philosophy. We don't need Viper exactly, but we need something that pipes flags directly to config fields.
Well, so that's what I'm wondering. So the other routes that you can go about this are just if those flags are specified, the config flag is banned, and if you detect it, you error. Or we could just not have those flags and just say only config, its version. If you want anything besides the name, you need to anything that is not just a simple per instance thing, you need to use the config.
Go Fabrizio. Yeah, sorry.
I think that the problem will be fixed if somehow we will have the flags that map exactly on the config, and we define some sort of precedence or some rules. For instance, the flag must override take precedence on the config, and considering how the config the developer is changing in kind, I see that now basically we are losing per node configuration because there are no more hooks, and there is only the only configuration that is not level is the role.
Well, so we actually need to add some back. The first thing is we need the ability to mount host paths to nodes.
Per nodes?
Yeah.
So are you thinking that I make a cluster and I add some node path on the control plane, some other node path on?
Right, because if you're wanting to use this for persistence, you probably don't want all the nodes mounting through the same directory. You probably want to mount a subdirectory for each node.
Okay, so these blocks my idea that at the end the config will be really simplified to have a number of replica for each node, for each role. But okay, so we are in a state where the flags will never match the config because the flags are an abstraction or an oversimplification over the config.
That's almost definitely. I think. I mean, we've had a number of features like that requested, and I think it's only going to expand over time that people want to treat these more like they would a normal node and want to be able to, set things on them. I mean, so something else we're going to want at some point for testing purposes is the ability to set different nodes to different images so we can run a mixed Kubernetes version cluster. That sort of thing is going to wind up needing per node config.
Makes sense.
And back on the load balancer thing, I think that no matter how we approach it, we should at least probably break it off, because most of the options that make sense for a control plane or worker node are not going to make sense on the on the load balancer, like the kubeatum config patches.
Yes, it's definitely not a Kubernetes node in that sense. It's
I'm also
just
apologies. But go ahead, Lumir.
no, I just wanted to say that if we are going to patch kubeadm configs per all the nodes in the list, we should probably exclude the load balancer. I mean, we can keep it in the same list. It's okay. Config-wise, I think.
Well, so what I'm thinking is that, like, depending on what we wind up adding to the load balancer, most people are not going to want to touch anything about the load balancer at all. It exists if you have multiple control plane nodes, which a lot of people are also not going to do, because that really only makes sense if you're testing, like, say, kubeatum. If you're doing anything else with kind like the cluster API using or something, you're likely sticking to a single node. If you go to multi-node, you probably just want multiple workers, so you can test things like rollout. Multiple control planes shouldn't be super visible to like most workloads.
So in my opinion, it's not too much work for the users to always add it's a couple of lines, I think, to add the load balancer. And if somebody like requests eventually the admin configuration for the load balancer for HA proxy, it's going to be very easy for us to just expose it.
Right,
otherwise,
but
if we hide it by default, I think it's going to be slightly more difficult to handle it. Yeah.
So we can still expose it, but instead of putting it in the nodes field, we can have like a load balancer field or something. I think the only reason it would make sense to have like a load balancer in the nodes is maybe if you're going to allow to have multiple load balancers doing different things, but even then it should probably be a different field, because the format of what you can configure is different than a Kubernetes node.
In my opinion, it makes sense to open an issue and track all the config possible improvements, and make up our mind before acting, because a new release of config is always a kind of, it requires some works.
Yeah, I'm
conversion and also
hoping
also
I'm hoping we can figure out some of these here though, and go ahead and move it. And like, we shouldn't need to make super substantial changes after that, besides maybe adding more fields, like adding the host path configuration.
Oh, so this is a topic I wanted to discuss. I mean, it's really scary to move the config into beta that early. I mean, that's my experience from kubeadm. I'm just saying, we basically were in alpha a couple of years, and I think that unless there are objections, I mean, we should keep the config in alpha as much as possible, and this allows us to be very flexible in the changes we make. We can pretty much nuke entire structures out of the config, and nobody is going to mind, because
I don't think most users are going to be paying too much attention to whether it's alpha, but in the meantime, they are going to be paying attention to how many times they have to change their config format.
Yeah, that's true. But as an example, the cluster API is still pre-alpha, and we have a lot of companies already using it. I guess my point is that
I think it's important that people get a response from us that, like, we are supporting this and that we are not going to break them, and that we're able to like quickly release other changes, because we're going to need to release often to fix small issues with Kubernetes. Like, for example, when we had that DNS issue, and if we keep changing the alpha format, then people can't safely upgrade easily.
I mean, we can still, in kubeadm, what we did is we keep the old format for one more version. We keep it I mean, Lucas explained to you, I think.
Oh yeah, but they still have to make the effort to switch. And I mean, I know because of that, like, for example, personally, I was never excited to upgrade because I knew I was going to spend some time on that sort of thing.
Yeah.
I'd really like us to get to a point very soon where I can upgrade kind without thinking about it. I shouldn't need to think about it, and that should let you live against Kubernetes master branch. You should be able to test that, but in order to test that safely, you're going to need to keep upgrading kind periodically because we're going to need to put small workarounds in until maybe perhaps someday Kubernetes decides this is an actual supported thing. But in the meantime, we have a weird environment and we periodically need to patch around these things.
So if you want to move to beta quickly, do you have a plan in how much time, approximately?
I was hoping optimistically for the Kubernetes 1.14 release.
Well, that's basically 1 month. That's quite scary. We have to basically in 1 month we have to consolidate all the changes we want to add into the beta, and that's pretty scary because the main problem here, as you may know, is that everybody is super busy. And I mean,
yes, but I am mostly just working on kind, and I think almost everything else we're changing is purely additive, like host path or specifying image, and additive things won't break it, but doing something like splitting out the load balancer does break it.
I have three things that are in my pipeline to propose for kind. One is just two are for improving the Kubernetes code coverage, and test the one is add another type of node, which is the external etcd, which is a scenario support. It will be basically very similar to the load balancer. I will spin up a node and run an etcd on this an etcd in Docker on this node, and this is and this cover a set of this will improve the test grid of Kubernetes by testing the scenario. This scenario. The second part is the one that I didn't have time to figure out yet how to do it. I have some idea, which is how to use kind to test Kubernetes upgrades, because Kubernetes is now we are using Kubernetes as a signal for being able to support Kubernetes upgrades, but we don't have a good test coverage, and this is a tricky problem because to make this happen, basically you need two versions of Kubernetes installed in your Docker. The version that you use to spin up the cluster and the version that you upgrade to. I did some testing in trying to extend the build process, and I have an idea which is from some point of view is nice, that you have. I don't want to mess up too much the build as it is, but I think that we have to support with another command the possibility to patch an image, because I don't know, I want to add a Docker image because I always use the dashboard.
Right. So actually,
having a new set of bits.
Having a command to load Docker images is something I've thought about for a while, and I'm thinking hopefully this week will PR. I think we can support two Kubernetes versions without actually supporting it by just having better tooling for loading stuff into the containers.
Yes.
So if we have a way to patch in another image that you want to load, and then we can just use like CP to add binaries to it. We can have a small tool outside of kind run the upgrade.
Running the upgrade will be another action, and this is
I don't think upgrading is something that we want to put in scope for kind right now. That is that's a complicated thing, and it's also something that I wouldn't want other users using. I think it'd be great for like Kubernetes testing to use it, but I don't think that's something that we should like advertise as, look, you can run upgrades, because no one should do that. It's a hack.
I think
No,
as it stands, it seems like there's kind of two different use cases here that we're looking at. One of them is kind of with kubeadm is obviously a lot more advanced. And I think one of the things that we've always tried to say with Kind is that it should be usable as a library as well. So perhaps if we can provide what we want to ship to users as a Kind CLI, and then actually provide packages or like where you can go and get a reference to a cluster and then say, cluster.loadImage or cluster.exec, and easily execute commands in kind of instead of just bash hacks with a Docker exec or something like that, we can actually then get into the containers, because then you could write your own test framework that goes and actually reliably executes these commands and handles.
I totally agree, and because the other use case is another use case that is to support the workflow of developers. I'm a Kubernetes contributor, so my workflow is spin up and tear down cluster every second, and I need more control. So basically, what I'm doing now, I developed a utility that connects to an existing kind cluster, and it is my utility is just a wrapper on top of Docker exec that has a kind of notion of topology. So I can execute a command on all the worker nodes, so I don't have to care about the name of the container. So it is, and having this separate command for address for use case, for me it is perfectly fine, because I don't want to put too many use cases into Kind. One of the thing that I really appreciated is that it is simple. The main problem I have now is that something is internal, like for instance, the framework for running images, and does not allow me to extend the Kind except with the very basic wrapper around the Docker exec. So I'm in favor of these.
I believe is the node exec stuff not exported? I believe that's exported now.
The node exec, yes, but if I wanted to implement my own action, for instance, the upgrade.
Right, but do you actually need the internal actions framework to do that if you have the ability to run commands on nodes and you have access to the cluster information?
I want to define my own action.
Right, but you can, there's not a lot of code in the action framework. You can write something outside of Kind that runs a sequence of commands.
I can duplicate the action framework.
I think that's actually the best route to go right now, and we should potentially even consider shipping that, but as like a second tool. The internal stuff for that is going to need some rethink soon to improve some things like the boot time. We pay a lot right now for adding nodes.
Yes, and this can be made in parallel. And okay, it's just a matter to agree if what we want in the main Kind, and if the kind of wrapper for developer or for Kubernetes testing is acceptable from a CI testing perspective.
I think we should even consider maybe like having a second binary that we provide potentially once we have this site matured out. But just to keep separate, that like if you want to use Kind for general stuff, you should use what's going on in this. If you want to do super advanced Kubernetes testing stuff and it's potentially less stable because we're doing slightly more crazy things like upgrading the nodes, We have it, it's open source somewhere, but it's not the main binary.
Can we call it unkind?
Unkind? Oh no.
I plus one for me for this.
I think that we should get back to this discussion, like to make a unified way, like to execute stuff on a node, and it doesn't have to be a separate tool. I mean, that's another repo that we have to maintain up. So yeah.
So I mean, so we have some of that right now, but what James is talking about is having that as a package. I'm wondering if some kind of like Kubernetes CI testing infrastructure that is built around kind can be, unkind, kind, or whatever. And whether or not that lives in the kind repo is probably not super important. It might even be better for CI. I would actually argue it would be better to live somewhere else and vendor kind, because in the same respect, in kubetest, where we're going to start consuming kind for CI, we're trying to move away from actually, I know you worked on this, trying to move away from checking out upstream and running it, and instead fetching the stable binary, so that CI doesn't get surprise broken while we're developing kind. I would say the same thing if we're going to use this for Kubernetes testing, and it might take some more time to think out. Maybe we should put unkind or whatever it's going to be somewhere else and vendor kind as a library. And that will also give us another opportunity to firsthand think about how we improve kind as a library that is not just consumed by the main command line. Right now, other people are doing it, but we don't have as good visibility into those projects. And I know there's pain points, but I don't know exactly what all they are.
Yeah, I think it'd be great.
One of them.
It'd be great to see the majority of like the actual all of the underlying communication with each node and everything else going on within the kind repo and the kind package. Yeah, then if there were to then need, like, if you do really want a CLI around that, an unkind style thing, then it should really just be depending on kind. Just to say that you can see that you could quite easily do this from anywhere else, and yeah, purely experimental. I'd also say just quickly on the config and versioning and stuff like that with moving to kind of like beta. I'm pretty sure there is now some kind of provisions in the upstream Kubernetes project for like field level versioning, or at least being able to mark a field as alpha and then deal with it from there. So at least there's some kind of convention on that, which might be something to explore.
I do really think though, like we talked about, kind the main tool being fairly simple. I don't think it should take us much longer than another month to sort out a couple more small changes, and then just stop breaking people. Stop telling them that, okay, you can't do this thing config anymore. Like, we ripped out the hooks, but that was because that was too coupled to the internal life cycle, which is something that I think we will need to change, and it can be accomplished by other means. Similarly with like actions, I think we're going to need to refactor that, but for most use cases they don't need that, and for the other use cases I think we can solve it without exposing that part, so that we don't have to make it stable yet. But for like the basic config of I want some nodes, I don't see any reason there needs to be a super prolonged process to make that stable.
Yeah, the main problem here is the fragmentation of efforts, because from my experience in open source, this never ends up well, because at some point this kind testing infrastructure is going to want to make a change upstream where it's not going to be, like, it's going to become out of scope for upstream at this point. And it becomes a fork essentially. But yeah, we can do it.
I think we can. I mean, so we've been asking some other people to do some of this, like the SUSE guys. I know they wanted to test their special setup this way, but the changes that they initially want to make upstream didn't look the most maintainable for us. I think we're going to be able to make that work without forking, though, eventually.
Hopefully, yeah.
Particularly from the library use case, I think it's mostly there today. The node should have a pretty good API, and the cluster has a decent API, and those are fairly stable. But we do need to get around to marking some of those as well. And that does need a quick refactor too. In particular, the create call takes up too many arguments, and it really needs to take some kind of defaulted other subcontext thing as well. Similar, the podvan support. I think the same way we probably need to plumb through some kind of context with options the way we do build, and instead of having some like global and field that's set by scanning the environment. But I think we can do all these things without forking, and I think we'll have a better idea of what people need upstream if we do a little bit of that ourselves. Right now, there are definitely things that are very coupled between the library and the command line. The create call is definitely one of them. The logging and the standard out things like this better are another.
Okay, I can try to define the two open free issue, one for the extended build, so patching the node images, one for the developer use case, and one for the upgrade. And commenting on the issue, on those issues, we try to define what is in the core kind and what is unkind.
I guess the only other thing is figuring out where we want unkind to live. I mean, it could possibly even be in the same repo, but I think we'll get a stronger forcing function if we actually make it import to figure out what's exposed, what's not exposed.
I honestly don't want to follow another repo because I receive like 200 emails a day.
Oh no, it doesn't necessarily be another repo. For example, if we're just using it for upstream testing, it could potentially just be a directory in test infra.
Yes, so
similar to cube test.
And test infra is super scary in size. I don't think it should be there. Something about I wanted to talk about my plan for this cycle specifically. I wanted to integrate kind with the basic kubeadm tests, those that not the X on Y test or the upgrade test, but the basic ones on a branch. I wanted to integrate kind already with them, and basically I wanted to add some test CMD scripts inside the kubeadm repo, pull the kubeadm repo and run the test CMD scripts using the deployer that is already in kubetest. That was my plan, and I'm still probably going to continue with this plan regardless of the fact if we like split in unkind and kind and stuff like that.
So what is the long-term plan for that kubeadm repo actually?
So the repo is going to remain as an issue tracker, documentation holder, and it already contains a bunch of end-to-end tests.
Would unkind fit there then as a testing tool for kubeadm?
Depending on the size, if it gets too big, Tim Sinclair is just going to kick it out.
If it gets too big, then it probably does either need its own home or need to be upstream. But
it's probably not going to be accepted. By definition, already it's not accepted, I think.
Okay.
So the problem is that I already developed something which is unkind, and the problem is that it is 10 goal files, but it has a lot. When you start vendoring, it is a lot of things that you put in. So the vendoring directory, just only having Cobra, kind itself, and its dependencies is a 600 files. So I will talk with team about this, if it is acceptable or not.
I mean, if not, then I would suggest that maybe we just make another binary upstream somewhere in the command directory. And go from there in the kind repo.
Inside the kind repo. In this case, the vendor part will be there. Will be just reused, and we need another build, or I don't know if with Basel or
So basically, the idea here is to separate the user, the basic user, and the basic COI from this testing scenario that we want to do with KubeADM, like a separate COI.
Right. So we need some tooling for doing some much more advanced things for KubeADM testing, like the upgrades that I really wouldn't want anyone else touching, but I think makes sense for Kubernetes. For like basically anyone else, I wouldn't want to be supporting this.
How about we create different layers in kind? Like the proposal from Fabrizio initially, like you can pretty much hide a bunch of flags, and even the config can be abstracted in such a way that you can have a basic scenario and advanced scenario. And the advanced scenario is not going to be recommended to users at all.
If we put it in there, people are going to poke around and find it, and we can't say like, oh, this config format is supported at this level, if it also has these fields that you're not supposed to touch.
What if users find unkind and they decide to use that instead because it's more powerful?
Then we know we're doing something wrong.
I mean, I see.
And that's where I was hoping to put it somewhere else.
I see unkind as more of like the glue that you write, like for your project to work with kind better and to do what you need to do better. Which in this case, it's kind of all tightly related because it's all Kubernetes. But for me, on say Cert Manager, if I need to start doing something weird or hacky, then building that small little Go binary around it, or what I guess will eventually grow. I feel like that's kind of my project's thing. So it kind of falls under kind of Kubernetes more generally than just kind. Because I imagine in there's like, who else apart from KubeADM is going to want to do KubeADM upgrade testing? It is just for that, really.
Right, and on the same note, so for example, we could have made kind, like one of the earlier approaches of kind actually basically just had it as a submodule of KubeTest, but KubeTest is mostly CI glue. So we want to eventually to keep those separate and say, here's kind, you can use it. It's simpler and saner, and then KubeTest is over here somewhere else, and it has some more CI glue that for the average user, I'm not going to suggest that they use at the moment. And by average user, I also mean people that are doing CI testing, just not Kubernetes CI testing.
Yeah, unkind, from what I understand, sounds like it would be, maybe, I don't want to use the word replacement for KubeTest, but it kind of sits in a similar sort of category, I would imagine. It might be that KubeTest ends out execing out and executing unkind, which then goes and runs a sweep, but it seems to me like a wrapper for a test suite. I don't know.
Yeah, and so I agree. It might be a little bit too much overhead to make a repo just for that, in which case maybe we just put the tool upstream. But I still think it should be a separate tool.
I think that the idea of having a separate tool, at least at the beginning, while the use case shape out, makes sense. I will start by the issue, and then we decide where the line is. And in the meantime, I talk with Tim about the repo, and we decide when as soon as we have some more info.
I mean, we might not even need one. Maybe just a different command and just a big scary warning that's like, "Hey, this is our CI goop. You probably don't want this." We could even hide it in like the hack directory or something. Say, "This is where the CI goop lives. Leave it alone." And yeah, if we get it to a point where it's really stable, then maybe we should also move some of the features over into the main binary.
So, I mean, if we continue to add these features into the kind of the library portion of kind, then I would, maybe unkind becomes like the experimental edge release, because really to actually enable that in kind, you're just porting over the CLI code, as opposed to actually the main implementation. Everything else should all be the same, and we should be able to cherry pick across different features as and when, if there's a need to kind of do that, I suppose.
Right, but as you said, I suspect that the besides us right here working on stuff for Kubernetes, people are not going to need or want to do upgrading, for example, and that's CI glue specific to us. We should try to keep those separate.
I mean, they might decide to use that instead of the upgrade framework. Who knows?
Are other people using the upgrade framework today for things that are not testing Kubernetes?
I honestly do not know. Maybe there's somebody.
I highly doubt that given the shape that the upgrade framework is in.
It doesn't work, so I guess no. I guess the answer is no.
If they did, it would be really nice if they would help fix that.
But maybe someone is going to want to have this as an upgrade path for their cluster. I don't know. It just
Yeah, but I mean, we also can't agree to support everything that everyone ever wants to do. The project will become unmaintainable in scope. Kind of nice today because the scope is enough that I don't think it takes too long to learn how it works and what it does.
I wanted to take the last few minutes to ask you a question about in kubetest when I'm writing the deployer currently. Do I have an access to tokenized GitHub client if I want to make a API request?
You do not. What do we need to make an API request to GitHub for?
So I'm basically fetching the list of releases for kind to get the latest version.
I think what we should actually do right now is just code it into kubetest so that we can also have the file hashes so we can confirm. If we have the file hashes, then we can also stick it somewhere on disk and we can check the hash and avoid downloading it again. And then we can eventually rig up something for the CI image to have it already downloaded, and then it will go through that code path where it sees it already on disk, checks the hash, doesn't. And then every time we want to upgrade kind in kubetest, it will just be a matter of switching the tag and the download links and updating the hashes. I think that's not too bad. And as much as possible, we probably don't want to be depending on the GitHub API. If we really do wind up wanting to have some kind of indirect thing for this, we can probably just like stick a file in GCS like we do for the rest of Kubernetes stuff that says this is the latest tag.
I see. Okay. Because I went the whole route of basically fetching the list of releases, getting a binary from a specific release. Yeah. Okay.
That'll be really cool someday, and we should keep that code around. But I think we should avoid doing that right now because it's more complexity. And if you look at everything we're doing in test infra, we're trying really hard to not have to use the GitHub API more than we need to because rate limiting and other flakes and inconsistencies.
Yeah. I forgot that there is basically a request limit. So I just. Yeah, and there is no client, so this is not going to work.
Right.
May I make a question about test infra as well? Because what surprised me, I didn't know in detail how it works, but it looks to me that it builds the Kubernetes artifact every time. It is not possible to reuse the same build for all the tests that we are running on, for instance, on a PR. So build once and reuse many times.
So the short answer of that is we do that where possible, and there is some tooling for that. For example, just like downloading a build and running that. For pre-submits, it's a little trickier because of like the UX of that. We are eventually, hopefully, going to use Knative's pipelines to do this. Meanwhile, we have like a half-baked thing and we're backing off from that. And instead what we do is we build with Bazel and we use a remote cache. So it's not actually building almost all of it. It's basically just building the parts that changed. And then each of the pre-submits is actually kind of like racing each other to build those parts. If one of the pre-submits builds it first, the other one should reuse it as well.
But also the test made with kind will reuse this Bazel artifact?
They do. The kind supports building with Bazel, and we are using that right now for the CI. It speeds up the build significantly. It does make the build does still take non-zero time more than I'd like, but it is a lot faster than without the caching. Eventually, we would like to get back to not building multiple times. But things like how do you tell the CI to retest and stuff need more thought. And Fabrizio knows we have this run after success thing right now where you can change jobs to do that, but it's not well thought out. So we're currently in the process of removing it while we rethink that.
Oh, you meant me instead of Fabrizio.
Oh, sorry. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry.
It's we have to look at this as soon as possible because Steve is going to be angry, and Aaron wants to close the meeting. By the way.
Right. Thank you so much, Aaron, and thank you everyone for coming.
Bye.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Smoother ride next time, I hope. Later.
See you later.